Chapter 12 Squirrels, Scotsmen, and Some Other Beasts. Shortly after I fell under the influence of my great uncle Frank, I began to be something of a trial to my parents. Frank laid his ideas upon me when I was 5 years old, and I have not completely evaded his shadowy grip even to this day. He was a naturalist and collector of the old school who believed that everything in nature, from eagle's eggs to dinosaur bones, deserved house room. He also insisted that the only way to know animals was to live with them. He impressed upon me that, if it was impossible actually to live among them in the woods and fields, the next best thing was to bring the wild folk home to live with me. I proceeded to follow his advice, and on my first expedition as a budding scientist, I collected and brought home a cow skull and 2 black snakes, for which I found quarters underneath my bed. Mother said that snakes were not fit companions for a 5-year-old, but Frank, who had a good deal of authority in the family, took my side, and the snakes remained with us for some weeks until the landlord of our apartment heard about them. Those snakes were only the first of an interminable procession of beasts, furred, feathered, and finned, which I inflicted upon my parents. It is to their eternal credit that they managed somehow to bear with most of my house guests, nor did they attempt to discourage my bent towards practical zoology. I think Mother had some hope that I would become another Thoreau, or maybe it was that she simply preferred to have me declare my pets openly rather than have me secrete them against the inevitable and startling moment of discovery. There were a few such moments anyways. There was a time that I kept rattlesnakes in a bookcase, but that incident passed off harmlessly enough. Then there was a time when I was 6 years old and was staying for a week with my paternal grandmother. One afternoon I went fishing with another lad and caught half a dozen mudpouts, or catfish as some people call them. I brought the fish home so that I could live with them. Grandmother Mowat was an immensely dignified and rather terrifying old lady who did not easily tolerate the pranks of youth. Yet it was with no intention of playing a practical joke on anyone that I placed my catfish in the toilet bowl. I had no other choice, because there was no laundry tubs in the house, and the bathtub drain leaked so badly you had to keep the tap running while you took a bath. I was honestly and tearfully penitent when the catfish were discovered, and penitence was needed. Grandmother made the discovery herself at a late hour when the rest of the household was fast asleep. She forgave me, for she had a knowing heart, but I doubt that she ever fully forgave my parents. All through the early years before we moved to Saskatoon, our rented homes and apartments housed not only us 3, but a wide variety of other beasts as well. In Trenton, I had a Blanding's tortoise, a rare terrestrial turtle of which I was immensely proud and one day distinguished itself beyond all other turtles by talking. True, it spoke but once, and then under unusual circumstances, but nevertheless it actually did speak. Some of my parents' friends were visiting our home, and they were kind enough to humor me and ask to see my turtle. Proudly I got it out of the box of sand where it normally lived, and released it on the dining room table. I was chagrined when it refused to poke so much as a leg out of its shell. In exasperation, I prodded it with a pencil. Slowly it protruded its head, peered sadly up at us out of its old woman's face, and in the clearest but most despondent tones imaginable, it spoke a single word. "Yalk," it said, as distinctly as that, and then without further preamble laid an egg upon the tabletop. I kept that jelly bean-shaped leathery object on top of the stove for 7 months, but it never hatched. I suppose my turtle must have been a virgin. We left Trenton not long afterwards and moved to Windsor. Point Pelee National Park was only 30 miles away, and we used to drive to it on weekends so that I could do field work in natural history. One day I spied what looked like a crow's nest in a tall pine, and I climbed up to investigate. It turned out to be a black squirrel's nest containing 3 young squirrels. Naturally, I brought one of them home with me, carrying it inside my shirt. Without really meaning to, I rather overdid Great Uncle Frank's precept, for I spent the next few days living very close to a band of several hundred fleas. The little squirrel took readily to captivity. We called him Jitters, and Father built a cage for him that hung over the kitchen sink. It had a door that he could open and shut by himself, and he had the run of the house, and later of the neighborhood. He was an ingratiating little beast, and one of his favorite diversions was boxing. He would sit on the back of a chair and box with us using his front paws against our forefingers. Jitters liked people, but he hated cats, and he waged a bitter vendetta against them. Our own cat, whose name was Miss Stella, our landlady at the moment, became incredibly neurotic as a result of the torment inflicted upon her by the squirrel, and eventually she left our home forever. The cats of our neighbors suffered severely too. It was Jitter's delight to seek out an unwary cat sunning itself beneath a tree or under the lee of a house wall. Jitters would then quietly climb high above his victim and launch himself into space like a diving sparrowhawk. Since these leaps were often made from 20 or 30 feet up, the impact when he struck was sufficient to leave the poor cat breathless. By the time it recovered, Jitters would have scampered to a safe vantage point from which he would taunt his enemy. We had Jitters for over a year, and in the end it was his cat baiting that killed him. He died rather horribly. One afternoon he launched himself from halfway up the wall of our 3-story apartment building and landed on what he supposed was a sleeping cat, but upon instead a foxskin neckpiece laid to air on a concrete balustrade. By the time we moved to Saskatoon, my parents tended to take my interest in natural history for granted. Yet even they were startled one night shortly after we arrived in Saskatoon. Mother was having a dinner party for a number of local people whom we had only recently met. When dinner was ready, she called me up the back stairs, and I came down to join the party a little dreamily, for my mind was filled with the thrill of great discovery. I had just begun to practice dissections, and that day I had found a dead gopher that had proved to be an ideal subject for experiment. When Mother had called me, I had just completed my preliminary work. I had removed most of the internal organs and placed them in a saucer formaldehyde solution. The problem of identifying all these parts was a nice one, and I was so preoccupied with it that I brought the saucer with me to the dinner table. It was a candlelit dinner, and no one noticed my saucer until after the soup had been served. I finished my soup before anyone else and decided to employ the waiting moments by continuing with my investigations. I was so lost in them that I was not aware of the peculiar dying away of conversation on either side of us until my father's voice aroused me. "What in heaven's name have you got there, Farley?" he demanded sharply. I answered eagerly, for I had just that instant made a momentous discovery and one that I was anxious to share. "Dad," I cried, "you'll never guess. I've got the uterus of a gopher, and she was pregnant." Hector McCrimmon was among the guests that night, but he survived the experience to become one of our best friends. The 30 bachelor years he had spent in Canada since leaving Caithness in northern Scotland had not altered either his accent nor his Presbyterian sense of rectitude. For 20 years, his home had been a room in one of Saskatoon's hotels, and if ever a man was immovably settled into a habitual pattern of life, it was surely Hector. Nevertheless, when we moved our caravan out to the Saskatoon Country Club for the summer months, we pressed Hector to join us for a bucolic weekend. He would have refused the invitation outright if he could have done so gracefully, for he had no love of the out-of-doors. His hotel life may have been dull and confining, but it was comfortable, and Hector was eminently a comfortable sort of man. He evaded the issue of the country weekend with skill and perseverance, but in the end we were too much for him, and in mid-August he found himself committed to a 3-day visit. It was in a mood of Christian resignation that he eventually arrived, for he put little faith in my father's glowing assurances that we lived in the very lap of luxury. Our camp was on the riverbank, in a dense stand of poplar. The caravan stood in a little clearing, with the open-air fireplace before it, and farther back towards the trees an umbrella tent, which was the private place where I lived and slept. My parents had decided that Hector should have my unoccupied bunk in the caravan, but when Hector heard of this arrangement, he was horrified. "I'll nae do it," he cried vehemently. "Would ye have me sleep between a mon and his lawful spouse? Foosh and for shame. Come, Angus, sin ye have no place for me to lay my head, I'll be back to Saskatoon for the night." I don't know how much of the outburst was really due to his Presbyterian scruples and how much of it was due to the last minute but canny attempt to escape from country living. But if it was escape he had in mind, he was doomed to failure. "Nonsense," Father replied heartily. "You can sleep on the spare cot in Farley's tent. That should be decent enough even for an old Puritan like you. But," and here my father's voice betrayed a trace of hesitation, "it may not be quite as peaceful there as in the caravan." Hector knew that he was beaten, but he would have the last word. "Peaceful," he said bleakly. "There'll be little peace for me until I'm home." It was a prophetic statement. After supper, my elders remained around the fire, drinking hot toddy and swatting at mosquitoes. I retired directly to my tent, for I had chores to do. During the summer, I had made a strenuous effort to obey the injunctions of Great Uncle Frank, and as a result, the tent had become far more than a bedroom. It had become a place where I could really live in close contact with nature, for I shared the tenancy with a dozen chipmunks, a partially tamed long-eared owl, 3 bushy-tailed wood gophers, a least weasel, and a baker's dozen of garter snakes. Each species had its own quarters. The snakes lived in a cardboard carton under my bed, the weasel in a gallon-sized tin can, the chipmunks in an orange crate faced with flies screening, the wood gophers in a wooden tub, while the owl was free to range at the end of a long piece of twine tied to the tent pole. The makeshift cages were not all they might have been, and whenever I went into the tent, I could usually count on finding some of my comrades on the loose. However, on this particular evening, Father had drawn me aside after dinner to warn me sternly that there must be no escapes that night. Having made everything secure, I went to bed. I awakened briefly at Hector's belated arrival in the tent some hours later. He undressed in darkness, fearing perhaps it would be indecent to do so by the light of an electric torch with which he was provided. A number of mosquitoes had followed him into the tent, and although they did not bother me, for I buried my head underneath my sheet, they seemed to annoy Hector. He muttered and thrashed about for a long time. Sometime well after midnight, I was awakened again by the detonation of thunder overhead. Coincidental with the earth-shaking crash, there was a disturbance at the tent door, and Mutt pushed his way inside. He was inordinately frightened of thunderstorms, and when this one burst, he abandoned his usual sleeping quarters under the caravan and fled to me for solace and protection. I could see Hector, outlined against the flailing canvas by the flicker of the lightning, sitting up in his bed and thrusting one long leg, like a Maasai spear, at something between the two cots. "Whoosh!" he cried sharply. "What was that?" "It's nothing, Mr. McCrimmon," I replied. "Only Mutt coming in to get out of the rain." "Mutt be domed," Hector yelled. "It's the devil himself." At that moment, Mutt, who had crawled under my cot, gave a convulsive leap that almost overturned the bed. Immediately, there was a scampering across my blankets that told me my chipmunks were no longer their little home. Hector was now lashing about with arms and legs and making such violent contact with the walls of the tent that I was afraid the whole thing would collapse. "It's all right, it's only chipmunks," I called in an attempt to soothe him. He did not waste his breath in reply. He had found his flashlight, and suddenly its yellow beam flooded the tent. I saw at once that I had been wrong. It had been neither Mutt nor the chipmunks that had been bothering him. It was my owl, which was now crouching in a belligerent attitude on Hector's pillow, gripping the still wiggling body of a wood gopher in its talons. There was a look in the owl's eye that boded no good for anyone who tried to interfere with it. Hector had no intention of interfering. With one amazingly agile motion, he reached the other end of his bed. He huddled there for a moment as if uncertain what to do next, and then he made up his mind and swung both feet down to the tent floor. The floor was of canvas, but it was old and no longer waterproof. Sufficient rainwater had already seeped through to dissolve the bottom of the cardboard snake box. The snakes were probably as upset as any of us, and when Hector stepped on one of them, the poor beast coiled convulsively around his ankle. Hector's vocal response to this new stimulus was so impressive it wakened my parents in the caravan. Through the drumming of the rain and the rumble of the thunder, I could hear my father's voice crying with some asperity, wake up, Hector, you're having a nightmare." And that, as Hector admitted to a mutual friend at the Albert Hotel some weeks later, was no so very far from the truth, if you ken what I mean. That long-eared owl was the first of my owls. It was followed by many more, but of all of them, by far the most memorable were the two great horned owls which joined her family the following year. The natural science teacher in my school was a keen wildlife photographer, and it was his great ambition to take a series of pictures of great horned owls. He enlisted my aid to discover a nest. This was a mission after my own heart, and as soon as the snows passed in the following spring, I began my search in company with Bruce Billings, a youngster of my own age and inclinations. Every weekend, Bruce and I would pack our haversacks and tramp the poplar bluffs looking for owls. At night, we would build a lean-to shelter, a wickiup, out of branches. Then we would make our supper fire and cook a meal of bacon and eggs and tea. As darkness came down, we would lie on the now green grass and listen to the prairie sing. From far off would come the yelping of a coyote, answered and echoed by others, and dying away at last into a distance beyond hearing. From the sloughs the frogs would babble, and the shrill piping of night-migrating sandpipers would come on the dark wind. Sometimes we were stirred by the reverberating cry of sandhill cranes so high above us that when they crossed the moon's face they were really no more than midges. But our ears were not really tuned to those voices. We were listening for the gruff hoo-hoo-hoo of horned owls, and when at last one of them would call, we would lay sticks upon the ground, pointing toward the sound. With the first pallid dawn we would be awake, damp with the dew and eager for the warmth of a breakfast fire. Later we would take our bearings for the direction the sticks pointed, with Mutt romping ahead as an advance guard. We would be searching every poplar bluff along the indicated lines of march. It was always a long search, but never tedious. Every bluff had its occupants, and they were fascinating in themselves. Among the edges of the copses, wood gophers would chuckle fearlessly at us, for they seem to have a liking for man, and do not flee from him, as do their saffron-colored brothers of the open plains. Within each bluff itself, there would usually be at least one large nest high in the poplars. Often it was a crow's home, and the raucous scolding of the owners would follow us for miles. Sometimes it was the immense roof nest of a pair of magpies. Sometimes it was an old crow's nest now occupied by long-eared owls, whose sly cat faces would peer at us nervously as we walked by. Sometimes the nest would belong to a pigeon hawk, the trimmest of the little falcons, or to a pair of the great-winged hawks, Swainsons or red-tailed. And between the bluffs and the short new grass, meadowlarks and vesper sparrows would burst from underfoot, their nests hidden from us until Mutt's snuffling nose found them out. Mutt never disturbed birds' nests. He only found them for us and stood by while we poked and peered and occasionally took one of the eggs. The moment when we at last halted beneath the untidy bulk of a large nest up a high poplar and staring upward could identify the home of the grizzly owls was an intensely thrilling one. It was an emotion to be matched only by the excitement of climbing the tree, with eyes cautiously averted and yet with many furtive glances at the huge bird above. Only once was I actually struck by a defending owl, and then it was a glancing blow that probably resulted from a miscalculation on the owl's part. But the wind-rushing dive of a bird with a 5-foot wingspread as it swerved to miss my head by a hand's breadth was as thrilling to a boy as ever the charge of an attacking lion was to a grown man. Once we had found a nest and had assured ourselves that it was occupied, we would report the news to our teacher friend. In the days that followed, we would help him build his blind. These blinds were rickety affairs of branches and canvas tied and nailed in the treetops adjacent to the nest. The owls seldom took kindly to the arrival of neighbors, and on one occasion an owl attacked the face of a newly built blind, ripping the tough canvas to shreds with its inch-long talons. But eventually the blind would become no more than another part of the landscape, and the birds would ignore it and its occupants. For long, hot hours I used to sit hidden from the owls and watch their lives. I seldom used the camera that I carried, for I was too fascinated by the birds themselves. At first they seemed no more than brute beasts, bloodied with the game they brought back, yellow-eyed and savage to behold. But in time I began to see them differently, as living things whose appetites and fears and perhaps pleasures, too, were not so very different from my own. I grew more and more enamored of them. When we were preparing to leave the last of the 3 nests we had photographed that spring, I decided that I was not yet ready to sever my acquaintance with these interesting birds, so I carried one of the young ones home with me in my haversack. The owlet was flightless and still possessed much of his fledgling down. Nevertheless, he had presence, and we decided he would be named Wall, after Christopher Robin's sage but bumbling old friend. Later that summer I came by yet another young horned owl. I found him held prisoner in an oil barrel where he had been placed by a bevy of youths who were intent on destroying him by inches. Bedraggled, filthy, and exhausted, he was a pitiful sight when I first beheld him. I parted with a hunting knife that was a prized possession and found myself the owner of a second owl. We named this one Weeps, for he never got over his oil barrel experience, and he never stopped caning as long as we knew him. Him and Wool were as different in character as 2 individuals could be. Wool was self-assured, domineering, and certain of his place in the sun. Weeps was timorous, retiring, convinced that fate was his enemy. They differed in appearance too, for Wool was of the Arctic subspecies, and his adult plumage was almost pure white, touched only lightly by black markings. Weeps, on the other hand, was drab and sooty brown, and his feathers always appeared shabby and frayed at the ends. These 2 were among the most fascinating animals that I have ever known. They gave me a great deal of pleasure, but they made Mutt's life a hell on earth.